Good evening, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of Great Decisions at Manitowoc Public Library. Before we get started, of course, I need to thank the sponsors for our series, because without them, we would not be here for these 8 wonderful weeks. So, without further ado, many thanks to the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, and the Lakeshore Unitary Universalist Fellowship. You can grab a seat. You know, a round of applause for our sponsors first. But come on and grab a seat. It's just me talking. There's no better time to sit down than right now. So, before I introduce our speaker this evening, I just wanted to let everyone know that our creamer situation with coffee and tea, our long national nightmare is half over. There is Creamora, so we have dry creamer. We have no liquid creamer. I will do my best to rectify the situation for next week. But for tonight, it's just dealing with the powdered stuff. So, sorry about that. That's my only announcement for the evening. So let me introduce our lecturer. Yoshiko Herrera is professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She received her BA from Dartmouth College and PhD from the University of Chicago. She was on the faculty of the government department at Harvard University before moving to UW-Madison in 2007. At UW, she is a past director of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia, and former director of the UW-Madison partnership with Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. Herrera teaches courses on comparative politics and the Russian war on Ukraine. She was a recipient of the Chancellor's Distinguished Teaching Award at UW-Madison in 2021, and a distinguished Honors Faculty Award from the College of Letters and Science Honors Program at UW-Madison in 2024. She is the author of 2 books and numerous articles related to Russia and Eurasia, nationalism, xenophobia, and political economy. Ladies and gentlemen, Yoshiko M. Herrera.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you all for coming out. I'm really just so excited to see everybody here. I really love seeing people who are interested in learning about different things happening in the world. So just really happy to be here and very happy to see all of you, and hello to everybody online as well. As Tim mentioned, I teach classes on the Russian war in Ukraine, and I've given a lot of talks about Ukraine. But tonight we have something a little bit different, which is also to talk specifically about the European security aspect of the war. So I'm going to start out, though, with talking about the Russian war on Ukraine and why it started and how it's going, because that relates to how it's likely to end and what the implications are for Europe. So I'm going to start out on Ukraine and bring us around to understanding the future of European security. So let me start with, why did Russia invade Ukraine? I have here 2 images. One is the map of NATO enlargement from 1949 until 2024. And you can see that NATO started out in the darker areas, then there's the green, and then the darker green. And there's another map there of the former president and former prime minister of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, speaking last year at a children's geography conference, like a geography bee in Sochi, Russia. And that is a map that he had in the background, and he was asking kids questions like, where do Russia's borders end? And the correct answer for the kids was, Russia's borders don't end anywhere. Interestingly, on this map, they've divided up Ukraine, giving some parts of Ukraine back to Poland, giving some parts to Romania, taking the red part for Russia, and then they have this sort of rump Kiev state there. Okay, but why did Russia invade? One of the things I think that this lower map brings up is the idea of Russia's imperial ambitions. And those are sort of big words, but the core of this conflict is that Russia does not accept the independence and sovereignty of the states of the former Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, Russia sort of went along with independence for the former Soviet states, but it did many things to try to recreate the Soviet Union and try to influence politics in those countries, including the Commonwealth of Independent States, dragging its feet in troop withdrawals, and making various demands on various of the former Soviet states, including Ukraine. So Russia, I'm happy to talk about this in Q&A further, but Russia doesn't accept Ukraine as a state being able to make its own decisions, for example, about trade with Europe or about alliances. It doesn't accept Ukrainian nationhood in terms of culture and language and things like that. In the summer of 2021, Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, wrote, or at least his name is on a little booklet called On the Historical Unity of Russia and Ukraine, where he talks about them being one people and denying Ukrainian nationhood. So there are these imperial ambitions, and I call them imperial because they go back to the Russian Empire, and it goes along with the expansion of Russian global power and influence more generally. So that's one factor. Another factor has to do with Russian national identity and an anti-Western orientation of Russia. Putin has pushed very strongly on a narrative of the 1990s as a period of humiliation, of Russia being on its knees, and of NATO expansion as a symbol of Russian weakness. Now, it often comes up that NATO expansion, this is one of the Russian propaganda points, that NATO expansion caused the war, that because NATO was expanding or there was an imminent threat from NATO, Russia had to invade Ukraine. And I think this is shown to be not true in a lot of ways, but one of the key things is that NATO did actually expand in 2024. It added Finland and Sweden, countries which had been very strongly against joining NATO for most of the post-World War II era, but because of the Russian threat, recently decided they wanted to join NATO. And when those countries joined, Russia did not even move troops up to the north or anything like that, which kind of shows that they were never actually that worried about a NATO invasion. But the NATO expansion as a symbol of Russian weakness is a point that Putin has pushed for most of his time. And he also has a kind of obsessive narrative about World War II. This picture that I just put up is the 9th of May, Victory Day. And for Putin, the message of World War II is that without the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany would not have been defeated, which is arguably correct. But the problem with Nazi Germany from the point of Putin and the Soviets is not the Holocaust, not the taking over of countries in Europe, but the attack on the Soviet Union. So what's wrong with the Nazis is that they broke the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and they attacked the Soviet Union. And in this way, Nazism for Putin means anti-Russian or anti-Soviet. And that's why any government that he thinks is against them, like the Zelensky government in Ukraine, he calls it a Nazi regime because they're anti-Russian. And he's trying to fold in this World War II narrative with the current war to say it's just like that, just like before we're fighting the Nazis, this time with this Nazi regime in Ukraine, but it's just like World War II. Most people obviously don't see it that way. Final thing is a miscalculation on the part of Putin. This is a picture of him meeting with his economic advisors. You can see for some reason, they started with these long tables. Now, it could be that Putin is a germaphobe, could be a post-COVID thing. Remember, this was 2022 when it started. Could be he's afraid of assassination attempts, like in War and Peace. Nobody really knows. But what it shows you is that he's not obviously that close to these people, literally. And he miscalculated in some important ways with regard to this war. Number one is that he was buoyed by previous military victories in Chechnya, in the two wars, especially in the Second War, by Georgia, small invasion in 2008, by his invasion of Crimea, part of Ukraine, initially in 2014, his bombing in Syria of humanitarian corridors, etc. And he got away with a lot of these things and expected that there wouldn't be very much international reaction to the 2022 full-scale invasion. He also thought that Ukrainians would not resist. And I think this is one of the most important points. And that's something that shows that the way that he sees the world is very different from the way a lot of other people see the world. I think a casual observer of Ukraine since 1991 would say, if you said at any point since 1991, how do you think Ukrainians would think about Russia invading? How do you think Ukrainians would feel about becoming part of Russia and not being their own state? There's a really strong commitment in Ukraine by a lot of different people from a lot of regions, a lot of different backgrounds, that Ukraine should be an independent state, even with their differences, etc. And it's sort of crazy looking at it to think that they wouldn't resist, but there's a lot of evidence that the Russians did not think they would resist. They thought they would be able to roll into Kyiv. They thought that President Zelensky would just go to Dubai or go someplace, that they would have an easy time of capturing the capital, and they'd set up their own kind of puppet regime, and that it wouldn't take a lot of effort. So he was obviously wrong about that. And Putin also calculated that the U.S. and Europe would be divided and would not care. Now, it kind of pains me, but we're going to get to this point in the lecture, that in the first few years of the war, I could just say he was absolutely wrong about Europe and the U.S. being divided or not working together. But obviously, there are more divisions now between the U.S. and European allies, although I still think, although Putin is hoping and wishing that there will be a bigger split between the U.S. and Europe, the level of divide that he's hoping for hasn't yet materialized. But the core thing I want to leave you with is that the driving force behind this war is identity concerns about Russia taking over Ukraine, about denying Ukrainian sovereignty and nationhood. It's not about territory, and it's not about the economy. So Putin didn't invade to make money, and he didn't invade because he wants 8% or 20% or 30% of Ukrainian territory. It's much bigger than that, and that's why, in order to end the war, offering him economic incentives or offering him specific little bit of Ukraine is probably not going to be enough. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about how the war has unfolded, and then that'll return us back to Europe. Okay, so tomorrow is actually the 4th anniversary of the war. Russia invaded on February 24th, 2022. And what I have up here on this map is what the war looked like as of March 31st, 2022. So roughly a month and a little bit into the war, Russia had attacked from the north, from the east, and from the south, and they had taken over all this area that's in red along in the left-hand side. In the fall of 2022, Ukraine pushed back Russian forces along a number of areas. And so these blue areas on the right are the area that Ukraine pushed back on in the fall of 2022. This map here is from February 19th, okay, from last week. And the red areas are the areas that Russia controls. So what that means is that since the fall of 2022, from around late October 2022 until now, there's been very little movement on the front line. The front has, which is around 750 kilometers, has more or less stayed the same. So there's been a tremendous amount of fighting for very little gain since the initial incursion in the first month of the war by Russia. Russia initially was successful. Ukraine pushed them back by October, and then the front line has largely stayed where it's at. If we look a little bit more in detail, this area of Pokrovsk, which is in this territory of Donetsk. So there's 5 Ukrainian provinces, kind of like our states. So Russia occupied Crimea in 2014. It started a war in the so-called Donbass in Luhansk and Donetsk Oblasts here. And these other areas are areas that they invaded in 2022. So what the white lines are is the rest of those administrative regions. So if you think of, a state, the red area is the area that Russia occupies, and the rest is like the administrative boundary of that state. So, so in some areas like Luhansk, Russia controls almost all of it. They control all of Crimea, but in these other ones, they don't. And most of the fighting that you're seeing is in this area here around Donetsk, and that's where this highlighted area around Pokrovsk is. So the overall front line is 750 kilometers, but at least a third of the fighting is just right around here. The territorial gains that Russia are making each year, as I said, like the front line is almost unchanged from what it was in 2022. So it's literally slower than a snail's pace. That is, if you put a snail on the ground and watched it move, you can see that the rate of territorial gain in some cases, like in the city of Chasiv, was less than 15 kilometers a day. Okay, so that means that you, 15 meters, not 15 kilometers, 15 meters, 15 meters a day. Okay, at the same time, these casualties can be up to 1,000 or 2,000 people a day. So they're moving slower than this famous Battle of the Somme in World War I, when you think of this trench warfare where not that much happens. And so what's happening is that even though Russia is putting a lot of manpower into fighting in these areas, they're making very little gains. And they don't have the backup forces to actually capitalize when they do make small incursions. If you look at it in terms of the overall casualties of what it's costing Russia, this chart is from 2024 from The Economist. And at that time, what they did is they listed spatially the Chechen War here, the Afghanistan War, that's 10 years of fighting by the Soviet Union, and the 2014 to 2022 Ukraine War. And then they estimated, this is only 2024, this is the high and low estimates for the number of people killed. So you could see already just from 2022 to mid-2024, they had many more losses in terms of killed than they had in the Chechen War and war in Afghanistan, etc. If you look overall at casualties, which are dead, missing, wounded, and taken prisoner, so all together, this is a recent estimate from CSIS that the total number of casualties, so dead, missing, wounded, taken prisoner, is now 1.2 million people. And what I want to point out to you is, remember I said right here is around where Ukraine pushed Russian forces back. And so from that point on, there's been almost no gain. So people are just dying in huge numbers for very little. If you look just at the last month in December, well, now 2 months ago in December, the total casualties, again, dead, missing, wounded, taken prisoner, for all of the Afghanistan war casualties for 10 years of fighting were 38,000 casualties, and just December 2025 alone for Russia was 35,000. So Russia now is at a point where they're losing more people than they're able to bring in. So even though people say, well, it's a big country, just look at the Soviet Union and they just have an unending supply of people, nevertheless, they have extremely high losses and they're having to replenish these number of casualties that they're losing each month. And so it's just just almost unbelievable number to think that they can get, they can average between 1,500 and 2,000 people a day. Recently, they had a low day, which was 680 people last week, but still those are enormous casualties. And why I mention this is that Putin does not care. He is not staying up at night thinking about this. He's not saying, this is terrible, I feel sorry for these people, these losses, etc. He does not care at all. The main thing he cares about is replenishing 35,000 people a month with new people. And so his concern, to the extent he's concerned, is about bringing in new people, not about these losses. And the way that they're bringing in people is to offer them huge, they have people from prisons, they have people who are now accused of violent crimes, murder, assault, etc., and their prosecution is suspended if they join the army, and they're paying huge sums of money to people to sign up. If you imagine a place where the average monthly salary might be $500 a month, they were offering between $30,000 and $40,000 as a signing bonus. So enormous sums of money, but that money is to some extent running out. Okay, so what else has happened? Russia has really ramped up its use of missiles and drone attacks on civilian targets. So if you look at when the war started, the number, these are just numbers of 200 up to 1,000 here. So when the war started in 2022, the number of missile attacks throughout Ukraine was relatively low. But you can see that 2025, this is the time of the peace negotiations. That's when they were firing hundreds of missiles per day into Ukrainian cities. And if you look at the drone side of it, sorry, it's a little bit light, but this gray was 2024 and the red is 2025. And you can see that just as of mid last year, the number of drone attacks into Ukraine is gone up substantially. Why does that matter? Because I think actually Putin had one chance of really winning the war, which was last year around this time. If he had solidified support of the Trump administration and gotten Trump to switch sides and support them, he might have had a much better chance of actually achieving his goals. But they just couldn't restrain themselves from these massive attacks throughout Ukraine on civilians, which even people who were sympathetic to Russia had to notice this is at odds with the overall discussion of peace. And the reason that they're attacking these cities is that they want to break the will of the Ukrainian people and have Ukraine give up. But despite all of this, despite Ukrainians this year, this is a picture of Kyiv, half of Kyiv, the capital city, was without power last month. They had, like we had, an unusually cold winter. So you just imagine your single digits and no heat, no electricity. Also, these big apartment buildings, that means no elevator. So just a really, really harsh winter that they thought they're just going to keep doing this throughout the country and people will give up and stop fighting. But in fact, instead, this is polling in Ukraine when they ask people, how much longer are you ready to endure the war? You see, even in January of 2026, 65% of Ukrainians say as long as is necessary. So it's down a little bit from the beginning of the war, but it's nowhere near the level of saying people in Ukraine are ready to say, never mind, we'll give up. Another thing, going back to this map, where these areas, the white areas, are directly what's being talked about right now in the land for peace negotiations. What's being offered to Ukraine is to say, give Russia these territories that they haven't been able to capture militarily. Now, I just showed you all those figures of how much fighting there has been in the last 4 years of the war and how little Russia has been able to achieve. And so what Ukraine is being asked to give up are these areas that they have been fighting tooth and nail every day, person by person, to retain. And you can see for that reason that 52% of Ukrainians say it's absolutely unacceptable to give Russia this land that they were not able to capture militarily. Now, Russia's looking at this saying like, hey, we've been losing 1,000 to 2,000 people a day and getting nowhere. Maybe we can get this through peace negotiations instead of capturing it militarily. And obviously, it's not just about whether the Zelensky government agrees to it. It's whether people in Ukraine agree to it, whether the military agrees to it. If you have so many people that are saying we've had all these losses, we don't want to give up, you can see that it's going to be difficult to get an agreement. Okay, so what is Ukraine fighting for? This is a picture of a cemetery in Lviv that I visited in 2024. It's a military cemetery. It's actually, these military cemeteries are in the parking lots of former cemeteries. So you have like an older cemetery, but they have so many new people, they just are using, that's why it's kind of like above ground. But you can see it's just truly heartbreaking to see the loving care that people decorate these graves and plant flowers and try to honor their loved ones. I gave a presentation last month, and somebody in the audience said he had recently been in Lviv and that they had actually closed this cemetery because it's full. So even that extended area is to capacity now. Okay, so Ukraine, they want an independent democratic state. Yes, they're a flawed democracy, but Russia is even more flawed, and they don't want to live under Putin's rule. They want to be able to choose their leaders through elections, to have a law-based society, and they also want to preserve the Ukrainian nation. They want to be able to speak Ukrainian, read Ukrainian books, not have libraries destroyed, which Russia is doing to Ukrainian books, etc. And they've already, as people see it, they've already sacrificed a lot. There's different ways to count their casualties, but at least 500,000 casualties, dead, missing, wounded, taken prisoner, and maybe 140,000 killed, but that could be higher. We don't really know the full number on the Ukrainian side. Also, this is another sad thing, is Ukrainian children who've been deported to Russia. Official numbers vary, a minimum of 20,000. Some people say a minimum of 35,000, but there's probably many more than that, because some of the cities that have been taken over by Russia have hundreds of thousands of people, and there's a lot of people that are unaccounted for. And this Ukrainian children being deported to Russia is part of this campaign by Russia to Russianize Ukrainians by literally taking small kids, moving them into Russian families, changing their names, giving them new documents, having them speak Russian, etc. That is a war crime for which Putin and the Minister for Children, Maria Lvova-Belova in Russia, have been indicted at the International Criminal Court for war crimes, but it continues to go on. There's also millions of refugees, people who have crossed an international border, moving into Germany, into Poland, into the UK, even into Madison. There are some Ukrainians who have moved, and some people have moved from these areas that are occupied by Russia or newly threatened by Russia. And there's a lot of people, internally displaced people, who have moved within the country as well. Some people have gone back in some places that were liberated, but some people, it's a difficult decision to decide whether you should stay or go, or how to make that decision. And then not to mention a massive amount of economic damage. So from the Ukrainian side, they're really fighting for the existence of their state. I think that's number one, but also with all these losses, they don't want to just give up these areas that they've been fighting for all these years to Russia and get nothing in return. Okay, so what has changed and what hasn't changed since 2022? That is our envoy to these peace negotiations, Steve Witkoff in Moscow. He's visited since 2022. He has visited Russia 7 times. He has not visited Ukraine one single time. He's a real estate guy. He actually does not know anything about the region. So I think he would benefit from hearing about the reasons for the war and what Russia is really after. Because as I mentioned, like, offering a real estate deal to Putin or some way of making money is just not what Putin is in the war for. Okay, what's changed? Obviously, we have new administration since the election of 2024 and inauguration in 2025, there has been, I call it a roller coaster of support for Ukraine. It's gone up and down. It could be worse. There could be better, but we're nowhere near the worst that it could be. There's also been a lot of new technologies in the war, including the advent of drone warfare on both sides. That has really changed the battlefield. That's where a lot of the casualties are coming from. A lot of drones are produced within Ukraine, so that's changed a little bit of the calculus of the needs that Ukraine has. But a lot of what Ukraine is asking for in terms of missile defense is to stop these missiles from coming in from Russia into civilian infrastructure sites in Ukraine. But interestingly, starting in 2025, the Trump administration started a series of peace negotiations. I like to point out to people that the Trump administration could have said, actually, like the vice president said, like, I just don't care about Ukraine. It's just not interesting to me. It's like, whatever, let them do whatever. But that's not the position of the Trump administration. They are interested in ending the war for various reasons, as we all know, the Nobel Peace Prize, et cetera. But the important thing is that they actually keep working on this peace negotiation. They could have walked away from it numerous times. They haven't. And so that adds a little bit of a different mix to what's going on. It doesn't mean the peace negotiations are going to work. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to benefit one side or the other, but it's interesting that the Trump administration has made it part of their policy that they want some kind of end to the conflict. I think it would be better if Steve Witkoff were a bit more knowledgeable about the reasons for the war and what it would take to end it, because everybody understands what it would take to end it, which is to put military pressure on Russia. That is the thing that's going to end the war. And without that, Russia is going to keep fighting. So what hasn't changed is the war, as I've mentioned, has been very costly and destructive. Ukraine has not given up on its commitment to nationhood and sovereignty. And Russia's maximalist goals of controlling all of Ukraine, destroying Ukraine as a nation, have not changed. And that's why when people say, oh, this deal that's being offered to Ukraine is so terrible, or it's unfair, or what do you think about that? I just go back to this, which is that Russia has not said one single time, here's what we need to end the war. Or we are interested in ending the war in this way. They never say they are interested in ending the war. There are people in Russia that say, oh, maybe if you did this or something, Putin would agree. Putin himself and his closest people never say, we think we're losing, we're going to give up. Or here's how we see the war ending. They never say that because they think they're winning. They think they can wait everybody out and they're going to keep fighting. So I think the key thing is that Russia needs to decide. It doesn't need to decide. Russia needs to be stopped. And they're going to stop when they're stopped. So if you're waiting for Putin to say, okay, I see your side, I understand you, that will never happen. He is going to keep fighting as long as he can. And it's only when he's under pressure, in my opinion, that he's going to stop. As long as both sides think that they're potentially going to win, which they both currently do, they're going to keep fighting. So the way to end the war is to convince Russia that it cannot win. And I just want to note, I was thinking about this actually in my drive up here, that in other major wars, people have understood that one side was not going to win, and the war sort of just kept going. So I would say at least by the summer of 1943, if not earlier, with the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II, people did not think that Germany was going to defeat the Allies and the Soviet Union. But it went on for more than another year, even though most people thought there wasn't likely to be a German victory. Now, maybe there were some people, besides Hitler, there was a few other people, but many people understood that Germany was unlikely to be able to successfully complete another offensive campaign. And the same with the Korean War, that the Korean War stayed fairly stable front line for a long time. And how did it end? Stalin died. And then other people sort of came to the table and said, okay, that's enough. Now, if you ask me what will happen if Putin dies, I will say the war will end. Because everybody in Russia realizes it's catastrophically costly to the country. But I don't think as long as Putin is around that he's going to voluntarily, he's not going to go into retirement. He's also not going to Dubai. He's not going into exile. And he's not going to say, okay, never mind, I changed my mind. So I think he is a real hurdle to ending the war. And that's why I don't think he's going to do it voluntarily. Okay, let's move on to Europe. In addition to different things in 2025 in the war, U.S.-European relations changed, I would say, pretty significantly in 2025. Obviously, there's a new administration in the U.S., but it's not just a new administration. There's other areas in which the U.S. and NATO have, I would say, there's been a break, at least in trust, between the U.S. And NATO. And some of these things are older, some are newer. So U.S. criticism of NATO funding, namely that NATO is not paying its fair share, has been voiced not only in the first Trump administration, but by also some others in the U.S. and around the world. So there's a longstanding criticism that the U.S. is paying for this post-World War II European security. NATO countries are not paying their fair share. A lot of that has changed in terms of an increase in the funding by other countries, but that's a longstanding criticism. The second thing is that the U.S. support for Ukraine has, as I said, it's been on a roller coaster. It's gone up and down. We had initially contributed a huge amount of weaponry and money to Ukraine, and now and still contribute a hugely important aspect of intelligence sharing and Starlink. So the U.S. has cut off directly supplying Ukraine, but we're allowing the European allies to buy weapons from us and give them to Ukraine. That was in doubt for a while. There was a period after the disastrous Oval Office meeting last year when even intelligence sharing was cut off with Ukraine. But it's kind of gone up and down. And recently, it turns out the Russians had been using illegal Starlink networks for communication on the front lines on their side, and that's recently been cut off by Elon Musk. Despite his criticisms of Ukraine, despite his friendliness towards Russia, he's cut off the Russian Starlink usage, and that's been a big boost for the Ukrainian side, actually. So that's why I say some people are very critical of the change in U.S. support for Ukraine. Some people would like us to do less, but we are not, it's not nearly as catastrophic as it could be. So I think Ukrainians and Europeans are at least grateful for what is continuing. Another thing in 2025, which is not totally new, but has been ramped up, is this embrace of Putin and other dictators, Kim Jong-un, Viktor Orban facing an election. He's the prime minister of Hungary, facing an election in April. He has been endorsed by the United States, and he's widely criticized for various kinds of undemocratic actions within Hungary in terms of the judiciary, the electoral process, etc. And why this matters for the U.S. and NATO is it's creating a bit of a values gap also between the U.S. and European allies. And last but not least is the potential U.S. invasion of Greenland, which thankfully was averted. But this map that I put there with the U.S. flag over Greenland, that was tweeted out by Stephen Miller, White House advisor's wife. That potential invasion of Greenland or a direct confrontation between the US and NATO allies in Greenland obviously would have severely weakened NATO. It already did do damage just to have had that discussion. But when you think of things Putin would want, what could he possibly hope for in his wildest dreams? Like, what could possibly be the best possible thing for Russia? He was hoping for tension between the US and Europe along the lines of, if there's sanctions, like which countries are paying the cost of the sanctions? Or if there's a cutoff of Russian oil and gas, like what would energy prices be and how would those be managed among allies, or that kind of tension? Or even he might have said like, oh, maybe the criticism of NATO funding will continue. So you think of like the things that Putin could dream about. An actual pullout of the United States from NATO seemed far-fetched. Like, how could that happen? But that, I think, was on the table last year in terms of the criticism of the U.S. for NATO allies. But this Greenland invasion just is another level of fantasy for the Russian side of like what could possibly happen that would weaken their biggest rivals and increase Russian dominance. So thankfully, the Greenland invasion was averted, but the threat of it and the harm in terms of distrust that it caused within the alliance is very serious. I think most people think not only is there a lack of trust, but the Article 5 part of the NATO treaty, which says an attack on one is an attack on all, is also seriously in doubt. Now, some people may disagree with me on that, but I think anybody in Europe that really believes that they can absolutely rely on the U.S. administration under Donald Trump to launch an all-out NATO war if one is attacked, I think that is just not a certainty anymore. It's just not clear what the U.S. position would be, and it would depend on which country. I suppose maybe if Russia attacked Hungary, Hungary has a better chance of being protected. But some of the Baltic states and some of the other states that are not as friendly with this administration aren't necessarily going to get the support if they were attacked militarily. Also, U.S. National Defense Strategy is a document that's put out different administrations. The 2026, and you could say, who cares about these reports that people puts out? Nobody reads them, whatever. But in light of what else was going on, people did look at what's in the U.S. National Defense Strategy. And what they find is that there is a clear focus on the U.S. homeland, not a focus on we're in it together with our allies, we're going to be there for you. It's about we're going to protect ourselves, and we think we're basically able to do that. It also says directly that Russia does not threaten the U.S. homeland, and that Europe will have to take the lead in protecting itself, and also that NATO allies and European countries will have to take the lead in Ukraine's defense. So it's nothing really surprising, but it's formalized in this document to say, like, in case there are any question, we are not there for you. So I think this has caused a lot of concern in Europe. Just like icing on the cake here is this most recent Munich Security Conference. This is a yearly conference held in Munich, which focuses on national security. They also put out a report. This year, the report, sorry, it's small type. The name of their report that they put out is called Under Destruction. And then the next, the subtitle of it is The World Has Entered a Period of Wrecking Ball Politics. Okay, that's the official line coming from Europe. This is Chancellor Merz from Germany meeting with Zelensky there. And Merz gave a speech where he said very bluntly, the post-World War II US-led rules-based global order is over. And what he means by that is, number one, the United Nations was founded on the principle of territorial integrity and respect for international boundaries. And Putin has violated that both in 2014 with Ukraine. He violated that in Georgia. He violated it again very obviously in 2022. And a lot of people think if we no longer believe in states' sovereignty and states having the right to decide their own affairs within their own countries, and we're just going to let stronger countries invade weaker countries, then this rules-based global order is over. Now, what's ironic is that no country has benefited more from the post-World War II institutional arrangements of global trade, free trade, the UN, different kinds of international institutions more than the United States. The United States became literally the wealthiest, greatest country in terms of strength and different kinds of measures almost in the history of the world. So as we sit here, having benefited from this global order so much, we're in the process of dismantling it and also complaining about being taken advantage of by other countries. So the Europeans understand that they need to do something. They understand that Russia is a threat, and they understand also from these speeches. Last year, Vice President Vance went there and lectured them on free speech and democracy and election integrity and immigration, and told them they're not doing a good job in terms of democracy. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, this year, he was a bit nicer about it, but he gave a speech in which he did not mention Russia as a threat one time. Instead, he talked about shared civilization with Europe, how the US and Europe have a shared Christian civilization, and so that should make us, nice to each other. But he didn't mention the concerns that Europeans have, namely this major Russian threat or this big break between US and NATO. And right after Munich, Secretary Rubio went on to visit Hungary and Slovakia, who are two of the most critical among EU countries. So he's kind of saying, I don't really support European unity by going to these critics of the EU and critics of democracy, frankly. So the message I think coming out of Munich is that Europe can no longer rely on the United States for security. Okay, so what is Europe doing about that? There are some cracks, as I just mentioned, with Hungary and Slovakia, but at the moment there's a lot of unity. However, in 2026 and in 2027, there are a number of elections in European countries. Some of those countries could elect governments that are either more pro-European Union or anti-European Union. They can be far-right parties. They can be pro-Russia, pro-Ukraine. There can be a lot of different things that happen within Europe in the next 2 years that could strengthen or could weaken European unity. There's also right now a reconsideration of nuclear umbrellas, of countries saying we can't rely just on a NATO deterrent. We have to have our own specific nuclear umbrella. The two countries in Europe that have nuclear weapons, the UK and France, are in discussions not only strengthening their own ties and their own operational control, but considering bringing other countries into that joint nuclear umbrella. And the issue here is that everybody that I was just talking about at that Munich Security Conference, these national security people, they all agree Europe needs to step up. They all agree it could do it. Actually, this is a US position too. Look how big the EU economy is. Look how rich you people are. Take care of yourselves. The question is, will they be able to do it? Will they be able to get over their own domestic concerns? And in terms of the EU, will the EU be able to bring these countries along? Okay, I'm almost finished here. People always ask, well, what's Russia going to do next? Is Russia going to attack the Baltic states? Is it going to attack Poland? What happens if Russia wins in Ukraine? Some people make those arguments, but what I want to share with you is something less, even more depressing, which is that Russia is already engaged in hybrid warfare against Europe and against the United States that is underway and it will continue. And what we mean by hybrid warfare is damage to these undersea cables, cyber attacks, GPS jamming, instrumentalized migration. They try to force people in different places, propaganda and disinformation. There's tons of evidence in Russia that this isn't a side thing in Russia. This is a direct government initiative now to put out propaganda and disinformation. Violations of airspace are going on a regular basis. Sabotage, poisonings, assassinations, as well as different military exercises. These are not really controversial, and every day there's more suspicious events that occur that people say, like, hey, how do we understand why that happened? And some people think that hybrid warfare is a precursor to actual kinetic military warfare. That's one way to look at it, as a preparation for war. Another way to look at it is just a war by other means. Because of the uncertainty over who carried out some of these attacks, they go unanswered, and I think that's likely to continue, especially if Russia is tied up in Ukraine in terms of its military. It's going to have to, it doesn't have the resources to launch a full-out invasion necessarily of some other countries. It might not want to do that with NATO, but this hybrid warfare is underway, and people either can decide to take it seriously, or they can say, I don't know, that looks complicated and hard to measure. Like, let's just forget about it. And so there's kind of a dual way of thinking about hybrid warfare. That on the one hand, it's complicated. Like, who knows what propaganda and disinformation is? How do you know what's true, what's not true? Like, let's just see how it goes. But some of these other things can be really dangerous. The attacks on civilian infrastructure, for example, through cyber attacks, electricity, et cetera, those are serious, and those can have big implications. So a lot of people think you do have to be prepared and able to counter those threats. All right, so last slide, returning to the future of European security. I just want to note, I think there's very little doubt that Russia is going to continue to try to weaken the United States and Europe, not just in our homeland, but like generally. They would like to limit global power. They are in informal alliance with China on that point of weakening the West. Many military analysts think it's a matter of time of Russia engaging in another military attack on one of the bordering states to the EU. But at a minimum, these kind of hybrid attacks are going to continue. And so what can Europe do? On the one hand, they could finally build up their own military capabilities more seriously. There may be some other international institutions beyond NATO that could be bilateral, UK, France, for example, different arrangements within the EU or within Europe in terms of trying to counter Russian threats. There's definitely a reconsideration of allies going on. Iceland is saying they may want to join the EU. Canada potentially is under consideration. Turkey, which has wanted to join the EU for a long time, but then was sort of on the back burner. Turkey is maybe an interesting and important ally if you're trying to counter Russia. But unfortunately, internal dissent and delay is still very much a possibility in Europe. So I think that we are in a point of change and potentially consequential decisions in 2026, but things could go a lot of different directions, and I can't tell you what direction that will be, but hopefully for the better. All right, thank you very much.
All right, let's get to your questions and comments, as is the norm for this year. I think there he is. Stacy will be working the north side of the room. I'll be working the south side of the room. If you have a question, just get your hand up and we'll get you the mic. And remember, just ask one question so that other people can ask other questions. So when that's all done, we can add more. So here we go.
Yeah, how strong is the pro-Russian sympathy in eastern Ukraine and Crimea?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so Russia annexed Crimea. A lot of people, what happened in 2014 is that Ukraine since 1991 had kind of gone back and forth. Most presidents except one, as incumbents, had lost elections, and they kind of vacillated between overall pro-Ukrainian, pro-Russian, with people in the East being more pro-Russian. But what happened when Russia invaded Crimea in 2014 is that there was a lot of separation, that people who were pro-Russian, like a third of the Ukrainian Navy, switched sides and went to the Russian side. Who was left in Ukraine were people who were more pro-Ukrainian. So a lot of people who had been pro-Russian already had switched sides going back to 2014 in Crimea. They had never given very much voice to Crimean Tatars and people like that. And so within Crimea, it's a very controlled population, and you don't have people who are pro-Ukrainian at all right now living in Crimea. In the eastern part of Ukraine, you have a lot of people who are ethnic Russians or Russian speakers. They could be ethnic Ukrainians, they could be Jewish, they could be different ethnicities. But a lot of those people seeing the destruction that Russia has brought, and also just the concept of being part of Russia or being part of Ukraine, they already pretty much made that decision earlier by staying in Ukraine. So there's been a tremendous amount of unity across Ukraine post 2014. And if you look at the 2019 election returns, or even the election that was in 2014, somebody like Poroshenko in 2014, who's a Ukrainian nationalist, got a lot of support even in the East, and Zelensky also got support across the whole country. So a lot of the previous divisions have kind of been muted by events that have overtaken them.
Coming around. There you go.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for being brilliant. Thank you for choosing Wisconsin. So in all of your analysis, you could tell us pretty much exactly what Putin is trying to do. Can you tell us the same about the President of the United States? Very seriously, I mean,
Yeah.
your opinion?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the question. So I think even before 2024 election, something I noted going back to the 2016 election is that I don't know why, but President Trump was always fairly supportive of Putin for a long time and supportive of Russia. If you go back to the 2016 election, when Donald Trump won the Republican nomination, and they're going to have the Republican convention, and the convention, who reads the platform, it's like blah blah, all these words, but the candidate, who I'm sure people that work on it, it's very important, but the candidates have the right to make some changes to the convention platform document, and the only change that candidate Trump wanted to make was to reduce the criticism of Russia in that Republican platform from 2016. Now, a lot of people claim there's blackmail, there's some kind of compromising material, something, et cetera. But I actually don't know what the reason is. But I could say, I don't know what the reason is, but President Trump has been pro-Russia for a very long time. And that's been consistent. This year in 2025 was the first time, and people noted it over the summer, the first time he ever criticized Putin. You may recall that after a particularly high number of missiles, it was, I think, right in the early part of July, President Trump said, well, I talked to him on the phone and everything seems fine, but then it turns out to be let's say not true, because he goes and bombs Ukraine again. So that's kind of as far as he got. He occasionally said in 2025, it looks like Russia's losing, but now he's back to saying it looks like Ukraine is losing. So there's variation in the support for Ukraine. The support for Russia has been very consistent. I don't think most people saw Greenland coming. under Xi, China does not want the West to win. So China is not particularly anti-Ukraine, but they don't want Putin to be deposed, and they don't want a big Western victory. So they would prefer somehow that the West is weakened, but that the war end, because China is also suffering a bit from the tariffs, but they are providing Russia with chips and other important military hardware or components that Russia needs for the war. Would they turn on each other? A lot of people think that at this point they have more to gain from working together against the West than from turning on each other, because the United States could be anti-Russia, but actually in that national security, national defense strategy, one of the things in it was that the U.S. is going to focus on China as a threat. And that's another actually question mark about President Trump. Like, what is his view on China? Sometimes he's negative on China, sometimes he's not so negative. And I think that the leaders in Russia and China also don't know where the U.S. is going there. So for the time being, I think Russia and China are working together against Ukraine in the war, but against the West to some extent. But China has not broken, for example, overtly said, we're not following the sanctions regime. So formally they say we're going along with the sanctions, but under the table they're sneaking things into Russia. But so far they've tried to kind of play it both ways.
I actually have a question from someone online.
Oh.
So you can just look at the camera for this one.
Sure.
What does Russianize mean besides allegiance to the flag and Russia? How deep is the Russian Orthodox Church in this?
Oh, interesting question. Okay, so the first part of it, what does it mean to Russianize? I think Russian language is a big part of it. So they want to not have people speaking Ukrainian, certainly not English. They want people to speak Russian. That's one piece of it. Allegiance to Russia and following what Russia wants. I mean, if you take a country like Belarus, for example, Belarus has a different language. They're allowed to keep that language. Kazakhstan has Kazakh. So some countries can have this other language, but they want to have official communications, et cetera, with Russia in Russia. And for Belarus, as long as they're doing whatever Russia wants, that's fine. For a lot of the former Soviet states, Central Asian states, in the Caucasus, as long as you kind of go along with what Russia wants, then, okay, you can keep your state. But if you try to do something different, if you try to join the EU, if you try to do something else, that's where you come into problems. Second part of the question was?
How much the Russian Orthodox Church has.
Yeah, Russian Orthodox Church. That's very interesting. So the Russian Orthodox Church is supported very strongly by Putin. And he's not only given them a lot of money, he's rebuilt churches across the country. They become much more powerful under his reign, especially in the last 15, 20 years. But Ukraine, this is a very complicated thing. There's a Russian Orthodox Church. Well, you may know. There's the Catholic Church. There's Greek Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy. There's Ukrainian Orthodoxy and Serbian Orthodoxy. But within Ukraine, there were Russian-affiliated churches. There's a Ukrainian Orthodox Church. There's the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that's allied with Russia, and there's the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is broken with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church allied with Russia. Some of the most important sites in Russian Orthodoxy are in Kyiv. So the issue of these churches and their artifacts and things like that is really a serious matter for people in Russia. Some people in Russia think it's a sin for Ukrainians to break with the Russian Orthodox Church. But within Ukrainian Orthodoxy, there's also division because Russia is also destroying churches. They're also persecuting Baptists or other Protestants or other Christians, Catholics. There's a lot of Catholics in the western part of Ukraine. So there's a complicated religious landscape in Ukraine. The Russian Orthodox Church doesn't really like any of that. They would like to have it all be under their control. But as you can imagine, these churches have resources and parishioners and things like that. And so it's not actually so easy to exert control over any of these churches by any of these external bodies. And even within Ukraine, there's divisions over what you should do with churches, for example, that are supporting the war. On top of all that, the Russian Patriarch of the Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church, he's extremely pro-war, even blessing missiles, and just absolutely in favor of the war. So he's not like a man of peace saying, I hope, I have empathy for everybody and that sort of thing. No, he is very much in favor of this war against Ukraine. So that kind of complicates it. Would Putin and the Orthodox Church like there to be a larger Russian Orthodox world out there? Yes, they would, but that's not as easily done as said.
Is it possible that the overall strategy for the United States is to hand off more of the responsibility for defense to our European allies so that we can play checkmate with the Chinese?
By that, if you mean so we can concentrate our efforts on the Chinese, yeah, that's possible. I mean, that's a decent interpretation to say, Europe, you have the money and the ability to manage this, so please take care of this. We have to deal with this China threat. I think that's a reasonable position. I think where it breaks down though was the Greenland potential invasion. Okay, that's where it's like, wait a minute, I thought we were kind of working in a sort of normal way, but this Greenland invasion potential kind of undermines that like regular person understanding of working with our allies. So, I mean, there's a lot of people in Europe that think President Trump is not wrong to say the Europeans should pay more for their defense and that the Europeans should take control over their own defense in the sense of being ready for meeting threats. They shouldn't be relying on the U.S. So I think on that, there's a decent amount of agreement that Europe needs to do it. I think the disagreement or unhappiness is in the way that it's being done, which is in a kind of very fast, like we might cut you off tomorrow way, where the Europeans are not quite ready. And that actually has led to a lot of discussion of whether NATO Secretary Mark Rutte is handling things well or not. I mean, he's kind of very complimentary towards President Trump and very trying to meet Trump's demands. Some people are critical of that. Other people say we have no choice because Europe is not ready right now for its own defense and we have to keep the United States along until we are ready. So he's kind of buying time. So there's, I think there's definitely something to that. And it's not at all the case that China is not a threat. So China is a threat. The threat of China towards Taiwan is definitely real. The threat of China in other places is real. All the things I said about hybrid warfare in Russia, China would love to be as capable as Russia on those fronts. And they're doing some of the same things in the Pacific in terms of testing the boundaries. So China is definitely a threat. Hi.
So Ukraine and Russia are both Slavic in their connection. What are the odds? Trump mentioned that Ukraine could slip. They could, if Zelensky is voted out or is killed or whatever, is there a chance that the Ukrainians could flip and just join Russia?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. I think at this point, the answer is no.
Because of the war.
Because of the war and because Russia has made itself extremely, extremely unpopular in Ukraine. Oh, I have another slide I could have showed you here. I'll just tell it to you. So if you look at support for NATO, support for joining the EU, and you go back to like 2005, the percentage of people in Ukraine that wanted to join is like under 20%. For both of those. And a lot of people in Ukraine were like, why would we join NATO? Why would we join the EU? We just got our own country. We want to be our own our own state. We want to decide our own rules, etc. But as Russia has ramped up its threats, Ukrainians now see their only chance for survival as becoming part of the EU and part of NATO. So and you can kind of see a similar thing with Sweden and Finland. They were historically against joining NATO in wide margins in the population, but people have switched. So I think it's very unlikely that even if Zelensky was out of the picture, that they would choose a pro-Russian candidate. I think that really ended in 2014.
Putin was on the picture.
Yeah.
Question at a time, thank you.
Okay, so if Putin is out of the picture, people ask me this all the time. I think if Putin dies, the war ends. Because I think there's enough people, now people always say like, what if somebody worse came along? Who is worse? I mean, look at what this guy has done. Not only, yeah, Hitler had more power than Putin, but in terms of the aspirations at this point, I don't know. I think it's a bit, okay, let's not go there. You know, they're both bad. But there isn't another person in Russia right now that has the following that Putin has. And I think a lot of people in Russia see the damage, the economic damage, the casualties, etc. The future prospects for Russia are so weakened by this war that I think it would be more like the Korean War, where when Stalin died, the next people were like, okay, whatever, we'll sign the documents, like, and the war ends. So I think that if something happens to Putin, the war ends. Russia does not become a democracy overnight, but they probably would take a less aggressive, less belligerent policy than Russia currently has, and I think the prospects for the war ending go way up. On the other side, with Zelensky, however, there's a lot of polling. Zelensky, so he has maybe 65% approval rating, something like that. There's other people that are more popular than him, like the former head of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Zaluzhny, like very popular guy. If there were an election, somebody like Zaluzhny would be definitely a front runner. It could be a scenario like Churchill in World War II. You know, you have wartime leaders that do a decent job, but you know, people get tired of them. They want something different. And so I can see in a post-war environment, it would surprise me if Zelensky were reelected. It would not surprise me if he were replaced by somebody else, but I don't think whoever he's replaced by would be pro-Russian.
Yeah, according to Google, Russia attacked Afghanistan Christmas Eve of '79. I think that's why the miracle on ice was so great. Anyway, and I believe that the reason that they pulled out of Afghanistan was because Russia lost so many troops that the population really turned against the war. I mean, I can't understand why. And it's probably happening, but probably not advertised, if you will. I'm sure a lot of the families in Russia that have lost soldiers in this Ukraine war, I mean, you're talking 35,000, and that was Russian troops, not Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, just Russia.
Yeah. I mean, what is going on politically with the support of the war among the Russian population?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. And I just have to give a shout out to both the men's and the women's U.S. hockey teams for winning. My son plays hockey and he plays at Bob Suter's Legacy 20 ice rink in Middleton. And that's owned by Bob Suter, who's one of the people on the 1980 team. So we're very pro 1980 Miracle on Ice, my family. Okay, so it's a very good question, serious question about what is the support for the war. Interestingly, okay, Russia is an authoritarian country. What that means is people don't have a lot of control over their government. And it's also a country where even using the word war will get you in jail. So there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of difficulties in measuring public opinion. If you ask people just directly, do you support Putin? You get 84% of people supporting Putin. If you say, how do you think the war is going? Similarly, you get, or is Russia going in the right direction? Something like that. You get like 60+% saying like, yeah, everybody's going fine. Everything's going fine. But if you ask specific questions, like around New Year's, they ask, do you think 2026 is going to be better for you personally or worse? And 66% say worse. If you ask people, what do you think the level of inflation is? They'll regularly say like 14%. It's actually 7%. So there's a lot of pessimism about the economy if you ask specific things. If you ask, have you benefited or your family benefited directly from the war? Only 7% of people say yes. So and 43% say they're worse off since the war started. So if you ask specific questions, you see there's a lot of anxiety and there's a lot of pessimism. Now, so far, the government has tried to manage that by shifting the burden for military conscription to people in the outer lying regions who are relatively poor, giving these huge payments to people, prisoners. So if you go to Moscow or St. Petersburg, you don't have families that are worried about losing their sons in the war. So far, they've tried to shield people in cities from the costs of the war. But despite what they're saying, I mean, Russians will say there's a battle between the TV and the refrigerator. The TV says everything's fine. The refrigerator says there's inflation. So people have their experiences and they know there's inflation. They know the economy is doing poorly, but they know they're in this context where they can't really talk about that. I think what's going to be a critical issue for Putin is how he's going to manage the mobilization of new troops in the context of less money that the government has and more losses. Like, where are they going to get people? They've already emptied the prisons. They've already been out in the countryside. They once tried a forced conscription, and that led to 1 million people exiting the country. And those are high quality, high education, qualified programmers, like people who you think would be adding to the economy. So there's no question the government is constrained with mobilization, but they don't really have any choice but to keep trying to mobilize troops. But I think this is going to be one of the areas that that people will be watching, is how are they going to replenish these troops. On the issue of casualties and support, and does that lead to support or not, there's a lot of political science literature on this, that most people, when they suffer some kind of catastrophic loss, like a son or daughter dies, their immediate reaction is not to say, well, they died in vain. Instead, it's to say, no, they served their country, they did the right thing. It's very hard for people to say this loss was for nothing. And it took, like, even in Vietnam, it takes like 10 years of bad news before people say, like, actually, this isn't going so well. So I think with Afghanistan, it took a while. For public opinion was never particularly in favor, but the end of Afghanistan in 1989 coincided also with Gorbachev, a different leadership that was willing to change a lot of things that the Soviet was, in fact, willing to destroy the Soviet Union in order to try to improve the countries of the former Soviet Union. So I think there's a lot of negative news. There's a lot of anxiety. People are aware of it, but they don't have a lot of options of how to do something about that. And it's just going to be a matter of big interest to see how the Putin government manages to mobilize the soldiers that it needs to continue to prosecute the war.
I have a question from this side of the room, but before I turn the microphone over to this person here, I have a question, and I don't count for either side of the room. So, and it piggybacks onto this question: how much is Russia turning to mercenaries to replenish these 35,000 people per month? And is there any sort of data on where they're coming from?
Okay, so they had what they called private military organizations. And so the most famous one was the Wagner Group that was led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, that you may have saw. He started this. So he's an unusual character. He recruited all these people from prisons. He was a direct competitor to the regular Russian army. So he wanted resources, weapons, stuff like that. And naturally, that put him at odds with the regular military command. He famously made all these videos complaining about the regular command, and then he took over the military headquarters in Rostov, and then tried to go up north to Moscow. Then he made a deal with Putin, and then he was killed after the deal. But the thing about that whole episode is that it revealed to the government that these private military organizations have their costs because they are competitors to the regular military. And so they really kind of downplayed the use of those since the Prigozhin mutiny. Now, they're still trying to pay people to get them to join the military. But the stories of corruption in the Russian military are so sad. So people get a signing bonus, for example. They sign up, they go to the front, and then the officers at the front demand money to not be put in the worst, most dangerous positions. So a lot of people use a lot of their signing bonus, not only paying off officers in their own units, but buying their own supplies, buying whatever from these places. So it's just a tragedy in multiple levels. But I think if Russia had the chance to hire other mercenaries to help it out, they would. But they brought in more than 10,000 troops from North Korea. They have tried to bring in troops from other countries, often under false pretenses, like getting people to sign up for jobs in Russia, but it turns out they send them to the front. That's happened with people from Nepal, from some African countries, from India. So they are trying to get people from different areas, but it's not popular. You know, it's not something people want to do even for a lot of money.
What could some possible deterrence against Russia look like for when the war does end?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. So one of the issues in the peace negotiations is so-called security guarantees for Ukraine. And so people used to talk about just Ukraine joining NATO, that would be the guarantee. But now with all the kind of tension, dissent within NATO, plus logistical issues for joining NATO, people aren't focusing on that so much. There's issues with, there's potential options are putting foreign troops from the UK, from France, from Poland, et cetera, in Ukraine. That's one thing. There's training of foreign troops in Ukraine. There's sort of rotations in and out, so maybe not permanently there. There's discussions of some kind of buffer zone for deterring Russia. But just like to go back to the Korean War, the contact line in the Korean War is about 250 kilometers, and in Ukraine, the current front is 750 kilometers. So it's quite a bit longer. And some of the areas in Ukraine come right up against major cities. So it's not as obvious how you would manage that. But some kind of buffer zone, maybe patrolled by drones, maybe some kind of no man's land. That's something people are talking about. But there's a lot of issues in this peace negotiation over, like, what would constitute a violation, for example? Like, Russia is currently violating airspace in NATO. Like, does that trigger? What is the trigger for further action? Sometimes these peace proposals have said, like, if Russia does something serious, then after a certain amount of time, we will do something. But it's like, what does it mean to be serious? And what's the amount of time? So, and Russia is making demands like Ukraine has to lay down all its arms. It has to demobilize its army. It has to do things like that. And Ukrainians are obviously negative on that. So deterrence, I think, for a lot of people, though, means massive armament, rearmament, armament, foreign troops potentially, and security guarantees in the context of if-then statements, like if Russia does something, then the U.S. will do something, or then Europe or certain countries will do something, or something like that. But those are the sequencing and specifics of those agreements are what needs to be worked out. Although when you look at these negotiations, people say we made a lot of progress. on security guarantees. So possibly they have worked out some of these things, but we haven't seen a lot of those details.
How do the numbers of casualties and the ability to replace their troops compare Ukraine's ability with Russia's?
Yeah, so Russia is more willing to lose troops or to have troops be injured relative to equipment at this point, because they've already lost a lot of equipment, and because of sanctions, they are having trouble replacing equipment. So Russia finds people to be more replaceable than equipment. On the Ukraine side, they also have a manpower problem, and they also have a force management problem in terms of like not just the number of people you have, but like how you use them and whether they get time off, etc. So both sides actually have manpower, force management problems, but a lot of people would estimate the Ukrainian casualties to be a third, let's say, of the Russian side. So still like very high, but not as high as the Russian side, because also if you're on defense versus offense, the offensive side will have more losses. So it's less, but it's still a lot. Now, Ukrainians are also developing little drone wheelbarrow things to get people off of the battlefield, for example. So if somebody's wounded, to like get them back to get medical care without sending another person out there. And I think they're going to continue to make care about and try to make advances in those areas. And it's just very clear that the Ukrainian side cares much more about human life, and that's why they have been reluctant. The Zelensky government has been reluctant, even though they're under martial law and men under age 60 are not allowed to leave the country except with permission. They haven't just mobilized everyone, 18 years and older. They've tried to keep the conscription age higher, but that's something they've gotten criticism for. So both sides are having trouble getting people to join. But I just will share one thing. A guy I met a couple of years ago in Kyiv, it's 2023. So he told me, he was maybe 30 years old then. And he said, well, I expect this war to go on a long time, years. And when I'm called up, I'm going to fight. But I'm not going to hasten my death or injury by joining now. So I know I'm going to be called up. I know the war is going to go on, and I am going to fight then. But I'm not leaving the country. But I'm also not just like enlisting right now. So that's another thing that makes it a little bit hard to know when you see people haven't signed up. Does it mean they'll never sign up? Or does it mean, like that guy, they're just waiting because they expect it's going to happen, but they're not moving along? I mean, imagine if you have a 18-year-old or a 20-year-old son that could be studying something in a tech school or in college, et cetera. Would you tell that kid, like, go to the front? Or would you say, like, well, stay here. Maybe the war will end. Maybe something will happen. So it's just hard. It's hard to know. A lot of people have signed up, but it's very it remains a critical problem for Ukraine.
Hi. Thank you again for all this information that you're giving us. My question today is, all right, Ukraine wants to join the EU. It was up for a vote, and the Hungarian Prime Minister stopped it. Now, and they're blaming it on an oil issue of some sort. How can that be resolved so that they can embrace the Ukrainian people?
Yeah, great question. I think everyone in Europe is hoping that everyone who's pro-European Union, that is, not everyone in Europe, the pro-EU people are hoping that Viktor Orban, as the polls suggest, loses his election on April 12th, I think it is. But people have hoped that before. He's actually the longest serving government leader in the EU. So despite thinking, he's definitely going to be out in this next election, he manages to carry on. So one possibility is that Orban is replaced. That would make a big difference for Hungary's support. But let's say he stays on. the EU has been dealing with Hungary's negativity towards Ukraine, negativity towards the EU for a long time, and I think they'll just like keep having this back and forth. Hungary will threaten to hold up something, to delay something, etc. Then they will go talk about it, and then like Hungary will agree to not vote, but not vote against or something like that. And so I think there'll be a continued back and forth with Hungary if Orban stays in power. But I think the EU leaders, one of the things they realize is that their democratic processes of taking a long time to have countries join the EU or doing this in this slow way, they're all looking at themselves saying, we're in big trouble here. Like, we are hoping to hang on and get things together before America cuts us off, before Russia invades. Like, we know we have a certain amount of time, but it's not infinite. We gotta get things going. So I think that you might see more of the same in terms of dealing with Hungary, but they might think of other ways of speeding things up by finding some way to deal with that dissent. And maybe the unanimity isn't going to be the way that they go forward.
This will be our last question for the evening.
Yes.
So I'm sorry, I had to scoot around you.
Well, the question I wanted to ask is, the reason we have to treat Russia with kid gloves is he's got nuclear. Now, the word nuclear never came out of any of your slides today, but that is the real reason we have to be so pussyfooting around him. My question is, what do the people of Russia, if he used it, we'd use it back. I'm sure our country would use it back. Is that a fear of theirs, or are they just saying, well, we'll do it first and then we'll be the winner?
Yeah, okay, so I didn't emphasize nuclear issues, but I did talk a little bit about this reconsideration of nuclear umbrella and the challenges of non-proliferation. A lot of countries like Germany that might have been totally committed to no nuclear weapons in the post-World War II era are reconsidering that position. Even nuclear energy they were quite negative on. In different circles. So I think that the issue of nuclear deterrence and the fear of nuclear escalation, is fair to say, was the core principle of the Biden administration. From the very start of the war, they were concerned about nuclear escalation, and every single thing that they didn't give Ukraine initially was because it could be seen as escalatory. Now, each thing in the end, whether it be javelins, going back to the Obama administration, tanks, F-16s, like everything that eventually Ukraine has been given, the initial discussion has been, we don't want to do this because it might provoke Russia. So I think a lot of people thought in the fall of 2022 that Russia might have been closest at that point to using a nuclear weapon if the Russian lines had disintegrated and Russia really thought they were losing. But now Russia has threatened nuclear use many times. I think a lot of analysts within Russia don't actually believe that Putin is planning to use a nuclear weapon. So the concern, they're still concerned, but I think the concern is lower than it's been at other times during the war. And it is a serious issue. But the whole nuclear question has changed a bit because so many other countries are talking about how they will develop nuclear weapons or how they might leave the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so just the confrontation between NATO, Russia, and nuclear escalation is no longer the biggest, it's still the biggest, but it's no longer the only issue. The other thing is like arms control negotiations. Interestingly, the Trump administration wants to include China in those because China is building up its nuclear arsenal. And actually, Russia doesn't like that because the nuclear talks between the U.S. and Russia kind of put the U.S. and Russia on parity. Like, we're the two nuclear superpowers, so we get to have these special talks because we're so important. And Putin really, really disliked, actually, going back to the George W. Bush administration, and then to Obama, the downgrading of talks between the United States and Russia, especially on nuclear issues. So I think it's still an important issue to think about the threat of nuclear escalation and how to deal with that. But I think the question has become much more multifaceted with the Trump administration switch to talk, including China, with the ending of all the nuclear weapons treaties. The last one just ended. And with the new renewed interest in Europe and other parts of the world for getting nuclear weapons, not to mention the potential for this war between the United States and Iran, supposedly also over the nuclear issue. So I think it's a really important question. I don't think anybody has the answer of what Putin will do, but I think people are thinking about it in a lot of different ways right now.
And unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this evening. So another round of applause for Professor Herrera. Great lecture. Hopefully you can join us next week for a lecture that builds on something that Professor Herrera brought up. We're going to be talking about multilateral institutions in a changing world order. The presenter will be Amitabh Pal, who is now based out of Madison and is a journalist and former editor for The Progressive. So we hope to see you next week. Have a great time. Make sure to be out of the building by 8. Thank you. Have a good night. Bye.